My name is Stella Sterling. I am 34 years old, exactly 1 week after I buried my husband. My brother-in-law invited me to a quiet family dinner to systematically strip me of a $22 million estate. I was standing in the kitchen of our Napa Valley home when the invitation came. The window was open, and the sweet, complex scent of blooming Cabernet vines drifted in from the rolling hills outside. Those were the same vines Julian had planted when he first took over his grandfather's failing winery. Back when we were young enough to believe that passion could outlast anything. As it turns out, passion, paired with relentless work, translates to $22 million in prime California real estate and a globally recognized wine label. My brother-in-law, Garrett, brought a high-powered corporate lawyer to that dinner. His wife, Caitlin, brought a sympathetic, deeply rehearsed smile. And I brought a single piece of paper that my husband had secured before his heart gave out, a document they had absolutely no idea existed. But I did not show it to them right away. I waited. I waited because my profession has taught me a devastating truth about human nature. If you give a greedy person enough rope, they will confidently, arrogantly tie their own noose. Welcome back to Alpha Empower Stories. If you have ever been entirely underestimated while grieving, only to watch the color drain from the faces of those who thought they could break you, drop a comment below and hit subscribe. You are going to want to hear exactly how this trap snapped shut. Let me tell you about Julian. He deserves to be remembered for the titan he was. Julian Sterling did not inherit a polished empire. He inherited 80 acres of diseased vines, a mountain of debt, and a family name that his older brother, Garrett, had already dragged through the mud with a series of failed tech startups. Julian didn't complain. He put on a pair of work boots and spent 50 years transforming that dying soil into Sterling Estate, an 800-acre, world-class vineyard with a state-of-the-art production facility and a private lakefront tasting room. He did it the slow, grueling way. No venture capital, no massive predatory loans. He reinvested every single dollar. He believed in roots. He planted a special block of heritage clones on the day we got married. He told me they would produce the best vintage of our lives. They did. Everything Julian touched thrived, everything except his own heart, a congenital defect we didn't know about until it was too late. Took him in a matter of months. I spent the season of his life sleeping in a chair beside his hospital bed, watching the man I loved fade into a shadow. His will was impeccably simple. Everything went to me. No trusts for his brother, no conditions, no corporate splits, just Stella. He trusted me completely, and that absolute trust is what made the betrayal that followed so incredibly repulsive. During his final week, Julian gripped my hand, his breathing shallow but his eyes terrifyingly lucid. "Stella," he whispered, "when they come for the estate, and they will come, look in the hidden compartment of the safe." He didn't need to specify who they were. Julian could read the chemical composition of a soil sample just by looking at the vines, and he could certainly read the predatory calculation in his brother's eyes. The week after the funeral was a suffocating vacuum. The house felt entirely wrong without him. There was no sound of his boots on the hardwood at 5 a.m., no smell of dark roast coffee, no quiet humming as he reviewed weather reports, but the vineyard did not stop. Agriculture does not pause for grief. The irrigation lines clicked on at dawn, the workers arrived, and the vines continued to grow as if the world hadn't just ended. I found his reading glasses on the nightstand. The left lens was slightly scratched from where he always dropped them face down. I slipped them into the pocket of my cardigan. They didn't fix anything, but the weight of them against my chest reminded me I was still here. Hank, our vineyard manager of 20 years, called me every morning. "Mrs. Sterling, the South Block is looking strong. You just rest, we've got the land." Hank was the only person who called to ask about the vines instead of the paperwork. Garrett called 3 times. The first 2 times, he didn't ask if I was eating. He didn't ask if I was sleeping. He asked about Julian's office. "Stella, have you located the master deeds yet? Have you spoken to the estate attorneys?" The third call came on a Thursday. Garrett's tone had shifted. He deployed the soft, syrupy voice he reserved for wealthy investors. "Stella, Caitlin, and I want to have you over for dinner tomorrow night. Just family. We know you're struggling and we think it's important we all sit down together and figure things out. Just family, a phrase that is almost always a prelude to a shakedown. I agreed. I told him I would be there at 7. What Garrett and Caitlin did not know, what Julian had found as and endlessly amusing, was that I was not just a supportive winery wife. I did not spend my days arranging flowers or hosting charity luncheons. Before I married Julian, I spent 8 years as a lead prosecutor for the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I currently operated as a senior forensic asset investigator for a private intelligence firm. My entire career is built on dismantling complex corporate fraud, tracking hidden offshore accounts, and legally annihilating billionaires who think they are untouchable. I can read a fraudulent contract faster than most people can read a menu. I have sat across from cartel financiers and watched them break. Garrett thought I was a fragile, grieving widow who didn't know the difference between an asset transfer and a grocery list. Friday evening arrived. I drove to Garrett and Caitlin's sprawling, aggressively modern house in a gated community in Silicon Valley. A house funded entirely by loans Julian had co-signed years ago out of familial obligation. I parked my understated sedan next to Garrett's leased Porsche. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my simple black dress. I adopted the posture they expected. Shoulders slightly slumped, eyes tired, a woman hollowed out by loss. When I walked through the front door, Caitlin rushed forward and enveloped me in a hug that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. It was a theatrical display of concern. "Stella, honey," she cooed, her eyes scanning my face for signs of weakness. "You look so exhausted. Are you managing to sleep at all? We've been so worried about you." "I'm surviving, Caitlin," I murmured, keeping my voice soft, intentionally fragile. Garrett emerged from the kitchen holding a glass of scotch. He smiled, a wide, practiced expression that did not reach his eyes. "Stella, come in, sit down, we just want to take care of you tonight." He led me into the formal dining room. I stopped in the doorway. The table was set for 4. "Are we expecting someone else?" I asked mildly. Garrett waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, a friend of mine is stopping by. Marcus Webb, he's a partner at a corporate real estate firm. I asked him to come by just to help us brainstorm some ideas about Julian's estate. Just as a favor, you shouldn't have to carry this burden alone right now." Just as a favor, I filed the phrase away. I sat down at the table, taking a sip of the sparkling water Caitlin poured for me. Marcus Webb arrived exactly 15 minutes late, a classic power play designed to establish importance. He was in his late 40s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a smile that looked like it had been surgically attached. He carried a slim leather briefcase. "Mrs. Sterling," Marcus said smoothly, offering a firm, practiced handshake. "My deepest condolences. Julian was a visionary. His loss is a tragedy for the entire industry." "Thank you, Mr. Webb," I replied quietly. Julian was very particular about who handled his vision. Marcus and Garrett exchanged a micro-expression, a rapid, almost imperceptible glance of mutual assurance. They thought they had the situation entirely under control. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Caitlin served a heavy roast, filling the silence with meaningless chatter about her country club, intentionally pivoting to Julian whenever the conversation lulled, expertly twisting the knife to keep my grief at the surface. Garrett poured expensive wine, playing the role of the protective patriarch. I ate exactly 3 bites of my meal. I remained silent, observant, playing the part of the overwhelmed widow to absolute perfection. The moment the plates were cleared, the ambiance in the room shifted. The predatory intent dropped its camouflage. Garrett leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. "Stella," Garrett began, adopting a tone of grave, paternal concern. "We need to talk about the vineyard. You are completely alone now. Running an 800-acre commercial operation is a massive, crushing responsibility. The supply chain logistics, the union contracts, the distribution negotiations. It's entirely too much for someone with no business experience to handle." I looked at him. No business experience. I had personally restructured the debt of 3 Fortune 500 companies in the last calendar year. But I did not correct him. I let the silence hang. We don't want to see Julian's legacy fail because you're overwhelmed. Caitlin chimed in, leaning across the table to gently pat my hand. We want to help you, Stella. We want to take this burden off your shoulders so you can just focus on healing. Marcus Webb took his cue. The briefcase opened with a crisp metallic click. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, impeccably bound, with 7 neon post-it notes protruding from the edges indicating where I needed to sign. He slid the stack across the mahogany table until it rested directly in front of me. This is a standard operational transition agreement, Mrs. Sterling, Marcus explained, his voice a soothing, hypnotic drone of legal jargon. It simply transfers the day-to-day management and operational authority of Sterling Estate to Garrett. You remain the primary beneficiary, of course, but Garrett will assume all legal liability and decision-making power. It is designed to protect your interests and shield you from the stress of corporate management. I looked down at the documents. I didn't skim them. I didn't glance at the highlighted signature lines. I picked up the stack and began to read. I read with the speed and precision of a federal prosecutor. I bypassed the boilerplate introductions and went straight for the operative clauses. I tracked the definitions of operational authority, cross-referenced the termination conditions, and analyzed the asset encumbrance permissions. It took me less than 3 minutes to find the trap. It was not an operational transition agreement, it was a comprehensive, irrevocable transfer of ownership. Buried in subsection 4B was a clause granting Garrett the unilateral right to leverage, sell, or liquidate the physical assets of the estate without my consent. The word beneficiary was technically in the document, but it was tied to a discretionary trust structure that Garrett would fully control. If I signed this, Garrett would own Sterling Estate, and he could bulldoze it tomorrow without giving me a single dime. Garrett, I said, my voice still soft, still measured. The commercial zoning options for the lakefront portion of the estate expire at the end of next month, don't they? The temperature in the dining room plummeted. Marcus Webb stiffened, his professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second. Garrett's eyes widened, completely derailed by the hyper-specific, highly technical question coming from the mouth of the fragile widow. I what? Garrett stammered. The commercial zoning options, I repeated, looking directly into his eyes. If this were merely an operational management agreement, there would be no need for the accelerated asset liquidation clause in subsection 4B. But if you were planning to sell the lakefront property to a resort developer, you would need total, irrevocable ownership before the zoning window closes. Which is exactly what this document grants you. Dead silence. Caitlin pulled her hand back from mine, as if she had been burned. Marcus stared at me, rapidly re-evaluating the woman sitting across from him. He realized, with a cold jolt of professional terror, that he was not dealing with a grieving yoga instructor. Stella, you're misunderstanding the legal terminology, Garrett said, his voice rising. A sharp edge of panic bleeding through the charm. Marcus is a top-tier attorney. This is standard protection. You're emotional, you're not thinking straight. If you don't sign this, the estate will hemorrhage money. You'll lose everything Julian built. I am not emotional, Garrett, I said, placing the documents gently back onto the table. I am forensic. I reached into my handbag. Garrett leaned forward, genuinely believing I was reaching for a pen to finally submit to his pressure. I did not pull out a pen. I pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. I placed it squarely on top of Marcus's fraudulent contract. It was a formal cease and desist order, drafted on the letterhead of my federal agency's private counsel, printed on federal watermark paper. It was addressed directly to Garrett Sterling and Marcus Webb-esque. Marcus picked it up. As his eyes scanned the first paragraph, the remaining color drained from his face. For your reference, Mr. Webb, I said, my voice dropping the facade of frailty entirely. It was now crisp, cold, and razor-sharp. Any further attempt to solicit, coerce, or fraudulently acquire assets belonging to the estate of Julian Sterling will be prosecuted under federal statutes for wire fraud, elder and vulnerable adult financial exploitation, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. Marcus swallowed hard. He looked at Garrett, then back at me. Mrs. Sterling, I was not informed that you had retained federal-level legal counsel. You weren't informed of a great many things, Marcus, I replied. I suggest you take your fraudulent documents, pack your briefcase, and leave this house before I decide to forward subsection 4B directly to the California State Bar Association for an immediate ethics review. Marcus Webb did not argue. He did not defend his client. He recognized an apex predator when he saw one. He shoved his documents into his briefcase, stood up, muttered a barely coherent apology, and practically sprinted out the front door. Garrett was shaking. His face was flushed dark red with rage and humiliation. You think you're so smart, Stella. You think you can run that empire alone. You're a widow. You have nothing. Julian's legacy is going to rot in your hands. Julian's legacy, I said, standing up and smoothing my dress, is protected by a woman who destroys men like you before her morning coffee. I walked out of the dining room. I did not look back. I got into my car, the scent of the Napa Valley night air rushing in through the vents, and I drove home in absolute silence. The war had officially begun, and Garrett had just handed me the exact ammunition I needed to annihilate him. Garrett Sterling did not take the cease and desist order as a final warning. Men like him never do. To a narcissist drowning in debt, boundaries are not stop signs. They are merely obstacles to be navigated around. The week following the disastrous dinner party, Garrett launched a coordinated, vicious campaign to undermine my credibility. He did not do it in a courtroom, he did it in the country clubs, the local wine tasting rooms, and through late-night phone calls to Julian's extended family. The narrative was meticulously crafted and deeply insidious. Stella is suffering a psychotic break from grief. She threatened us with lawyers when we tried to help. She is completely untethered from reality. Caitlin played the role of the tragic, concerned sister-in-law to perfection. She posted a photograph of herself and Julian on social media with the caption, "Missing you today more than ever. Julian, wish you were here to guide us through this dark time." It garnered hundreds of likes and a flood of sympathetic comments from the Silicon Valley elite. The subtext was thick enough to cut with a knife. I received a phone call from Julian's elderly aunt, Beatrice. Her voice trembled as she asked if I was eating, if I needed someone to come stay with me, because Garrett had told her I was having episodes. I told Beatrice the truth. I remained calm, measured, and entirely unbothered. I am not sure how much she believed me. Garrett was charismatic, I was analytical. In the court of public opinion, charisma usually wins the opening arguments. But I did not care about the court of public opinion. I cared about federal jurisdiction. 10 days after the dinner, a process server knocked on the heavy oak door of the Vineyard estate. He handed me a thick manila envelope. Inside was a formal court filing, petition for conservatorship and evaluation of mental competency. Garrett's name was listed as the petitioner. Marcus Webb's signature was glaringly absent, replaced by a low-level local attorney who clearly had no idea what kind of hornet's nest he was poking. The petition claimed I was suffering from severe diminished capacity. It stated that my refusal to accept standard estate management protocols was evidence of a cognitive fracture. It requested that Garrett be immediately appointed as the temporary financial conservator of Sterling Estate to prevent catastrophic mismanagement. I read the petition twice while standing in the foyer. The sheer audacity of it would have been hilarious if it were not so financially lethal. My brother-in-law was attempting to legally erase my autonomy, weaponizing my husband's death to steal an empire. I walked into my home office, locked the door, and initiated an encrypted video call with Phoebe Nguyen. Phoebe was not a local estate lawyer, she was the chief litigation counsel for my intelligence firm in Washington, D.C., a woman whose legal precision was matched only by her absolute ruthlessness in a courtroom. "Phoebe," I said as her face appeared on the monitor. "Garrett filed for conservatorship." Phoebe adjusted her glasses, her expression completely flat. On what grounds? Diminished capacity due to profound grief. He claims I am a danger to the financial stability of the $22 million estate. Phoebe actually laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. He filed a diminished capacity claim against a former SEC lead prosecutor who currently manages a 9-figure investigative portfolio. Did his lawyer run a background check, or did he just assume you were a housewife? He assumed I was a target, I replied, sipping my coffee. Let us disabuse him of that notion. Phoebe demolished the petition in exactly 72 hours. Her response filing was a masterpiece of legal overkill. She attached my complete, unredacted curriculum vitae. She attached documentation of the 3 Fortune 500 debt restructurings I had finalized in the past 6 months. She attached a sworn affidavit from the director of the Securities and Exchange Commission, attesting to my flawless cognitive function and strategic brilliance. But Phoebe did not stop at defense. She launched a counterstrike. She filed a motion requesting immediate sanctions against Garrett and his attorney for filing a frivolous petition, citing a direct, undeniable financial conflict of interest. She included a forensic analysis of Garrett's current liquidity crisis, proving he was underwater on 3 major development loans and desperately needed the vineyard's assets to avoid bankruptcy. The judge reviewed the filings on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, the conservatorship petition was dismissed with prejudice. The judge's ruling was brief and brutally clear: no evidence of diminished capacity presented. The petitioner's extreme financial distress raises grave concerns regarding the motive for this filing. Motion for sanctions granted. When Garrett received the dismissal at his office, Caitlin called me. She was sobbing, a hysterical, panicked sound. Stella, what are you doing? She cried into the phone. Garrett is furious. The judge sanctioned us. He has developers waiting for the lakefront property, Stella. He took out personal loans against this deal. If you don't back down, we are going to lose our house. You took out personal loans against land you do not own, Caitlin, I replied, my voice as cold as ice. That is not a business strategy, that is a gamble, and you bet against the wrong woman. He just wants what is best for the family. She shrieked. He wants what is best for Garrett, I corrected her softly. Do not call this number again, Caitlin. I hung up the phone. The legal battle was won. But the war required absolute finality. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went. I needed to know exactly what Julian knew before he died. The following morning, I drove out to the main production facility of the vineyard. The morning fog was still clinging to the rolling hills, giving the estate a ghostly, ethereal beauty. I walked into the main administrative office. It was a functional space, concrete floors, oak desks, walls lined with topographical maps of the soil composition. Hank, the vineyard manager, was sitting at his desk, reviewing the weekly harvest logs. He stood up immediately when I walked in, taking off his worn baseball cap. Mrs. Sterling, Hank said respectfully, good to see you. The crew is out on the north block pruning the canopy. Thank you, Hank. The estate looks beautiful, I said. I need to review the commercial printing logs for the past 6 months. Hank frowned slightly, confused by the request, but he nodded. Of course, the main server room is in the back. The printer logs are all backed up on the local drive. I walked into the server room and locked the door behind me. I booted up the terminal and ran a decryption script I had developed during my SEC days. I didn't need to look hard. Garrett had always been sloppy with his digital footprints. During Julian's final months, Garrett had frequently visited the vineyard office, claiming he was helping Julian organize the files. He wasn't organizing files. He was using our commercial-grade printers to produce full-color, high-resolution architectural renderings. I found the file cached in the printer's memory. I hit print. The machine hummed to life, spitting out 28 glossy pages. I gathered them up and laid them across the oak table in the conference room. The title across the top page was printed in a sleek, modern font: Sterling Lakeside Resort and Marina, Phase 1 Development Proposal. The logo of Garrett's real estate firm was stamped in the bottom right corner. I read every single page. The date on the cover letter was what truly stopped my breath. It was dated 4 months ago. Julian had still been alive, undergoing brutal, exhausting treatments, fighting for every single breath, and his brother had been sitting in this very office, printing the blueprints for his destruction. Page 3 outlined the projected revenue, $86 million over 5 years. Page 12 detailed the Phase 2 residential lots. Page 15 contained a section titled Vineyard Clearance Protocol. I stared at those 3 words, vineyard clearance. Garrett was not just going to sell the lakefront. He was going to bulldoze all 800 acres. He was going to rip up the heritage clones Julian had planted on our wedding day. He was going to pave over the soil my husband had spent 15 years reviving. He had reduced 40 years of agricultural legacy to a footnote on a demolition schedule. Page 22 referenced the timeline, anticipated acquisition following estate transition. He had timed the bulldozers to align with Julian's death. A cold, absolute fury settled into my bones. It was not the hot, erratic anger of a victim. It was the icy, calculated wrath of an executioner. Garrett had not just tried to steal my money, he had planned to erase the only tangible piece of Julian left in this world. I folded the proposal and placed it in my leather briefcase. I drove back to the main house. The sun was setting, casting long bloody shadows across the Cabernet vines. I walked into Julian's private study. The room smelled like old paper, leather, and him. I walked over to the heavy iron safe, bolted into the floor of the closet. I entered the combination. The heavy door clicked open. Inside were the standard documents. The master deeds, our passports, the insurance policies. But Julian had told me to look for the hidden compartment. I ran my fingers along the velvet lining of the interior roof of the safe. I felt a small, nearly imperceptible latch. I pressed it, a false panel dropped down. Inside was a single, sealed envelope. My hands, which had remained perfectly steady while dismantling Garrett's legal trap, began to tremble. I knew what this was. This was the voice of a ghost. This was the final piece of the puzzle. I carried the envelope to Julian's leather armchair. I sat down in the fading light. The envelope was heavy, the paper thick on the front. In Julian's unmistakable, sharp handwriting were the words, "For Stella. Only open this when Garrett makes his move." He knew, my brilliant, observant husband knew exactly what his brother was before the end. I did not open the envelope. Not yet. The instructions were clear. I was to read it when Garrett made his move. Garrett had made his move in the shadows, through fake sympathy and fraudulent contracts. But a betrayal this profound deserved to be exposed in the light. It demanded an audience. Next Sunday was the annual Sterling Estate Harvest celebration. For 15 years, Julian had hosted the event at the lakefront cabin. It was a massive gathering of our extended family, the vineyard investors, the local politicians, and all 47 families who worked the land. It was a day of wine, roasted lamb, and gratitude. Garrett had naturally assumed the celebration would be cancelled this year due to Julian's passing. I picked up my phone and drafted an email to the entire guest list, including Garrett and Caitlin. The Sterling Estate Harvest celebration will proceed as scheduled this Sunday at the lakefront cabin. Julian would have wanted us to gather, to drink the wine he grew, and to discuss the future of the estate. Please join me for a very important announcement regarding the legacy of Sterling Estate. I hit S. The trap was fully set. Garrett would undoubtedly view this gathering as a moment of weakness. An opportunity to swoop in, play the supportive brother in front of the investors, and perhaps corner me into a public concession. He would walk into the cabin wearing his expensive suit, armed with his toxic charisma, completely unaware that he was walking directly onto a scaffold. I leaned back in Julian's chair, holding the unopened envelope against my chest. The house was silent, but my mind was deafeningly clear. I was not just going to defeat Garrett Sterling, I was going to humiliate him so profoundly, so publicly, that his name would become a cautionary tale in Silicon Valley for the next 50 years. I watched the sun dip below the horizon, plunging the Napa Valley into darkness. I felt a quiet, terrifying smile spread across my face. Let them come, I thought. Let them all come. Sunday arrived in Napa Valley exactly the way Julian would have wanted it. The sky was an impossible, cloudless cerulean blue, and the air was crisp, carrying the faint, earthy aroma of crushed grapes and dry California dust. The lakefront cabin was not a rustic, dilapidated shack. It was a stunning architectural marvel of cedar and glass that Julian had designed himself, perched on a gentle slope overlooking a pristine private lake. The wraparound porch was expansive enough to host 100 people, and today it needed to. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the estate was buzzing with the kind of chaotic, beautiful energy that defined the annual Sterling Estate Harvest celebration. Long wooden tables were set up on the great lawn, covered in crisp white linen and heavy silver centerpieces. The massive stone fire pit was roaring, roasting a whole lamb sourced from a neighboring farm. The guest list was a microcosm of Julian's life. There were the high net worth investors from San Francisco, wearing casual linen suits and holding crystal glasses of our finest reserve Pinot Noir. There were the local politicians, shaking hands and securing alliances. And most importantly, there were the 47 families who worked the land. The vineyard managers, the cellar masters, the viticulturists, and the field crews. Their children were running across the grass, their laughter echoing over the water. I stood on the porch, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching the beautiful fragile ecosystem Julian had built. I was wearing a tailored ivory jumpsuit, sharp, clean, and completely unbothered. I had tucked Julian's sealed envelope into the interior pocket of my blazer. It felt heavy against my ribs, a physical manifestation of the storm I was about to unleash. At exactly 1:30, a sleek black Range Rover crunched up the gravel driveway. Garrett and Caitlin had arrived. They did not slip in quietly, they made an entrance. Garrett stepped out of the driver's seat wearing a navy blue blazer, an open-collared shirt, and a pair of designer sunglasses. He looked like a man who was already spending money he didn't have. Caitlin emerged wearing a flowy, aggressively expensive sundress, her face arranged into an expression of brave, tragic mourning. I watched them from the porch as they began to work the crowd. Garrett bypassed the vineyard workers entirely. He made a beeline for the VIP tables where the primary investors were seated. I watched him shake hands with Arthur Vance, our lead angel investor. Garrett leaned in close, clapping Arthur on the shoulder, flashing that brilliant, hollow smile. I knew exactly what Garrett was doing. He was laying the groundwork. He was planting the narrative. Julian is gone, Stella is struggling. The estate needs strong, visionary leadership to navigate this transition. I am stepping in to ensure stability. He was pitching them on his fictional authority, hoping to secure their loyalty before he executed his hostile takeover. He was entirely unaware that I had already forwarded my SEC credentials and a redacted summary of his fraudulent conservatorship, filing to Arthur Vance the night before. Arthur was currently smiling at Garrett with the polite, icy detachment of a man humoring a clown. Caitlin, meanwhile, was holding court near the catering tents. She was speaking to Julian's elderly aunt, Beatrice, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "It's just so hard," I heard Caitlin say as I walked past them, my footsteps silent on the grass. "We are trying to protect Stella, but she's so isolated. She's completely in denial about the financial realities of the estate. Garrett is doing everything he can to save Julian's legacy from going bankrupt." "Bankruptcy?" Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. "Oh dear heaven, is it really that bad?" "It's worse than you know, Aunt B," Caitlin whispered dramatically. "But don't worry, Garrett has a plan to maximize the land's value. We are going to ensure everyone is taken care of." Maximize the land's value, a sanitized, corporate euphemism for bulldozing 800 acres of world-class agriculture to build a concrete resort. I walked past them without breaking my stride. I did not engage, I did not correct her. I let them build their stage, completely unaware that I had rigged it with dynamite. I found Hank near the roasting pit. He was holding a pair of heavy iron tongs, looking distinctly uncomfortable in a button-down shirt. "Everything holding together, Hank?" I asked, standing beside him and looking out over the lake. The lamb is perfect, Mrs. Sterling, Hank replied, his eyes narrowing as he watched Garrett glad-handing a group of distributors. But I can't say the same for the company. He's been telling the seller crew that there are going to be major operational shifts by next quarter. He's scaring the boys, Stella. People with mortgages don't like hearing about operational shifts from a man who doesn't know how to prune a vine. He is not going to shift anything, Hank, I said softly. Hank looked at me. He had known Julian since Julian was a teenager, trying to figure out how to drive a tractor. Hank knew the soil and he knew people. He saw the cold, unyielding calculation in my eyes. You found something, Hank stated. It was not a question. I found everything, Hank. I need you to gather the core crew, the cellar masters, the field leads, have them move toward the porch in about 15 minutes. I want the investors there too. It is time to make an announcement. Hank nodded slowly, a slow, grim smile spreading across his weathered face. Yes, ma'am, I'll get them. I walked back up the wooden steps to the wraparound porch. I stood at the railing, looking down at the crowd. The noise of the party was a steady, joyful hum. It was the sound of a community that believed it was safe. I reached into my pocket and touched the envelope. I thought about Julian. I thought about the 15 years of sweat and sacrifice he had poured into this soil. I thought about the night we sat on this exact porch, drinking a bottle of our very first vintage, watching the moon reflect off the black water of the lake. He had looked at me and said, I didn't build this for the money, Stella. I built this so that when we are gone, something beautiful remains. Garrett wanted to erase that beauty to cover his gambling debts. I stepped up to the microphone that had been set up for the evening's toasts. I tapped it twice. The sharp, percussive sound cut through the chatter. The crowd slowly quieted down. Faces turned toward the porch. The children stopped running. The investors lowered their glasses. Garrett, who was mid-sentence with Arthur Vance, turned around, an expression of mild, patronizing indulgence on his face. He expected me to deliver a weeping, fragile eulogy. He expected me to publicly crack, thereby validating his entire narrative of my incompetence. Thank you all for coming today, I said. My voice was amplified, echoing across the great lawn. It was not shaking, it was not fragile, it was the clear, commanding voice of a federal prosecutor addressing a courtroom. Julian loved this harvest celebration, I continued, scanning the crowd. He loved this land, but more importantly, he loved the people standing on it. He always said that Sterling Estate was not a company, it was an ecosystem. And every single person here, from the investors who believed in our vision, to the 47 families who work these vines, you are the lifeblood of that ecosystem. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Hank nodded from the back. I found Garrett in the crowd. He was standing near the front, arms crossed over his chest, projecting an aura of absolute control. Caitlin stood beside him, maintaining her mask of sorrow. Recently, I said, my voice dropping slightly in pitch, forcing the crowd to lean in to listen, it has been suggested that I am incapable of managing this ecosystem. It has been suggested, quite aggressively, that my grief has rendered me unstable, and that Sterling Estate requires new, visionary leadership to avoid financial ruin. I paused. The silence on the lawn was absolute. The investors exchanged confused glances. This was not a standard memorial speech. My brother-in-law, Garrett, I gestured toward him with a slow, deliberate movement, has been very vocal about his desire to step in and protect Julian's legacy. In fact, 10 days ago, Garrett filed a petition in state court to have me declared mentally incompetent, attempting to seize total legal and financial control of this estate. A collective gasp echoed across the lawn. Aunt Beatrice dropped her wine glass. It shattered on the grass. Garrett's face went rigid. His patronizing smile vanished instantly. He took a step forward. His voice loud, panicked. Stella, this is not the time or the place. You are confused. Please, let's go inside. I am not confused, Garrett, I replied smoothly, leaning into the microphone. And I am not going anywhere. The judge dismissed your fraudulent petition in 72 hours because you failed to mention one critical detail in your filing. I looked out at the crowd, addressing the investors specifically. For those of you who do not know my professional background, I do not manage the books for local bakeries. I am a former lead prosecutor for the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I currently serve as the Director of Global Asset Recovery for a private intelligence firm. I investigate corporate fraud for a living. I dismantle criminal enterprises. The reaction was instantaneous. Arthur Vance let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter, looking at Garrett as if he were a particularly stupid insect. The rest of the investors murmured in shocked realization. The fragile widow narrative imploded in real time. So, I continued, ignoring the rising panic on Garrett's face, when a man who is severely overleveraged on 3 massive commercial real estate loans suddenly tries to legally strip me of a $22 million asset. I do not cry, I audit. I reached behind the podium and pulled out a thick, glossy binder. I held it up for the entire crowd to see. This, I announced, my voice ringing clear across the lake, is a 28-page development proposal titled Sterling Lakeside Resort and Marina. It was drafted by Garrett's firm. It was printed on Julian's office printer. The vineyard workers went dead still. Hank stepped forward, his fists clenched. Garrett, I said, looking directly at him. Would you like to explain to the 47 families standing here what Phase 2 Vineyard Clearance Protocol means? Garrett was hyperventilating. His face was a sickly ashen gray. Stella, stop it. You are taking it out of context. It was just a contingency study. A contingency study. I interrupted, my voice cracking like a whip. Page 3 projects $86 million in revenue from luxury condominiums. Page 12 details the timeline for bulldozing 800 acres of prime agricultural land. You were not planning to manage Julian's legacy, Garrett. You were planning to pave it over, to cover your own catastrophic financial failures. The crowd erupted. It was not a polite murmur, it was a wave of genuine, visceral outrage. The investors looked disgusted, the vineyard workers looked murderous. Hank had to physically restrain 2 of the cellar masters from marching toward Garrett. He's lying, Caitlin shrieked, her carefully constructed facade crumbling into pure hysteria. She's making it up. Garrett was trying to save us. Julian knew. Julian wanted Garrett to take over. That was the mistake. Caitlin invoked Julian's name to defend a betrayal. She crossed the final line. I lowered the development proposal. The noise in the crowd slowly died down, replaced by a tense electric anticipation. They saw the shift in my posture. They saw me reach into the interior pocket of my blazer. You claim Julian knew about this plan, Caitlin? I asked softly, stepping away from the podium so they could see me clearly. You claim he wanted Garrett to pave over his life's work? Yes, she cried, clinging to the lie because it was the only raft she had left in a hurricane. I pulled out the heavy, sealed envelope. This, I said, holding it up into the California sunlight, is a letter Julian wrote by hand 3 days before he died. He placed it in a hidden compartment in our safe. He instructed me to open it only when Garrett made his move. Garrett stopped breathing. He stared at the envelope, as if it were a loaded gun pointed directly at his chest. He knew Julian's handwriting. He recognized the heavy cream stationery from Julian's desk. Julian was dying, I told the silent crowd. His heart was failing, but his mind was razor-sharp. He saw the tape measures. He saw the blueprints. He heard the whispered conversations in the hospital hallways, while you thought he was asleep. I looked at Garrett. Shall we find out exactly what Julian thought of your contingency study, Garrett? Without waiting for an answer, I slid my finger under the seal. The paper tore with a crisp, echoing sound. There was no turning back now. The execution was about to commence. I pulled 2 sheets of heavy, cream-colored paper from the envelope. They were covered in Julian's handwriting, sharp, deliberate, and undeniably his. The crowd was so silent, I could hear the wind rustling through the oaks lining the lake. I smoothed the pages against the podium, adjusted the microphone, and began to read. Stella, Julian's words echoed across the great lawn, carried on the crisp afternoon breeze. If you are reading this out loud at the harvest celebration, it means I am gone, and Garrett has finally shown you exactly who he is. I wish I could say I am surprised, but my brother has spent his entire life looking for a shortcut, and he was always willing to let someone else pay the toll. I paused, looking up from the letter. Garrett was completely immobilized, his eyes were wide, fixed on the paper in my hands. The slick, corporate facade had entirely dissolved, leaving behind the terrified, inadequate younger version of himself he had spent decades trying to hide. I looked back down and continued reading. I built this vineyard from nothing. I spent 15 years turning diseased soil into something that produces life. I did not do it alone, I did it with Hank, with the field crews, and with you. But mostly, I did it to prove that our family name could stand for something other than debt and failure. A few of the older vineyard workers nodded. They remembered the early years, they remembered the 16-hour days, the frost scares, the sheer, unrelenting grit it took to save the estate. 2 weeks ago I read, my voice steady, merciless. I was in my office, reviewing the yield reports. Garrett came to visit. He thought I was Gusto's room. He did not realize I had come down to the main house early. I watched from the hallway as he booted up my computer, accessed my private network, and printed a 28-page proposal to bulldoze my life's work. Caitlin let out a small, strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. He wants to build a resort, Stella. He wants to pave over the heritage clones. He wants to fire the 47 families who depend on this land. He wants to take the legacy I bled for and turn it into collateral to cover his own toxic commercial real estate loans. And he assumes that because you are a widow, because you are grieving, you will simply sign it all away to him out of confusion. I stopped reading. I let the silence hang over the lawn, thick and suffocating. The investors, who had been politely listening moments before, were now staring at Garrett with open, visceral contempt. In the world of high finance, ambition is expected. Incompetence and familial treason are unforgivable. I raised the letter again. Garrett, Julian had written, addressing his brother directly from beyond the grave. If you are standing there right now, listening to this, I want you to understand two things. First, you have always been a coward. You borrowed money you could not repay. You made promises you could not keep. And you assumed I would always bail you out. Not this time. Garrett flinched as if he had been physically struck. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The sheer, overwhelming reality of his brother's final judgment was crushing him in real time. And second, I read the final paragraph, Julian's voice echoing with absolute, terrifying authority. You made a fatal miscalculation. You assumed Stella was a supportive, fragile wife. You assumed her silence was weakness. You never bothered to ask what she did for a living before she moved to Napa. You never bothered to look beneath the surface. You brought a knife to a gunfight, Garrett. And you are standing in front of the firing squad. I read the final sentence, delivering it with the cold, devastating precision of a hammer striking glass. Stella, burn his firm to the ground, protect the vines, protect the families, I love you. I folded the 2 pages slowly, deliberately, and slid them back into the envelope. I did not need to add any commentary. Julian's words had done exactly what they were meant to do. They had stripped Garrett of every illusion, every lie, and every piece of camouflage he had ever worn. The silence on the lawn was broken by Arthur Vance, the lead angel investor. Arthur stepped forward, buttoning his linen jacket. He did not look angry, he looked profoundly, terminally disappointed. Garrett, Arthur said, his voice carrying easily across the space between them. I have invested over $10 million into this vineyard over the last decade. I believed in Julian's vision, I believed in the agricultural integrity of this land. Arthur paused, looking at the development proposal resting on the podium. You invited me here today, under the pretense of stabilizing the transition. You stood by the catering tent and asked me for a $5 million emergency bridge loan to secure the operational future of the estate. You lied to my face. You intended to use my capital to fund the demolition of my own investment. You are not a visionary, Garrett. You are a common fraud, Arthur. Please, let me explain. Garrett choked out, his voice cracking. The resort would triple the valuation in 5 years. It's a guaranteed return. The only thing guaranteed, Arthur replied coldly, is that you will never receive another dime of venture capital in the state of California. I am calling my partners in San Francisco. By tomorrow morning, you will be blacklisted across every major real estate portfolio on the West Coast. Do not ever contact me again. Arthur turned his back on Garrett. It was the ultimate gesture of dismissal. The other investors followed suit, turning away, forming a physical barrier of rejection. Garrett spun around, desperately looking for an ally. He looked at Aunt Beatrice. She turned her head, refusing to meet his eyes. He looked at the vineyard workers. Hank and the cellar crew were glaring at him, with expressions that bordered on violence. Finally, Garrett looked at me. He took 3 steps toward the porch, his hands raised in a gesture of frantic surrender. "Stella, please," Garrett begged, his voice high and thin, the arrogance entirely hollowed out. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The loans are callable next month. If I don't secure the lakefront property, the bank will seize everything. My house, my cars, my firm, I'll be bankrupt. You have to help me. Julian wouldn't want me to lose everything." "Julian," I said softly, leaning into the microphone so the entire crowd could hear my final verdict, "specifically instructed me to burn your firm to the ground." "I am your family," Garrett shouted, tears of pure, desperate panic welling in his eyes. "You are a parasite," I corrected him. "You attempted to legally declare me mentally incompetent to steal my home. You attempted to weaponize my grief to orchestrate a corporate takeover. You planned to fire 47 families who depend on this land. You are not family, Garrett. You are a liability, and in my profession, we eliminate liabilities." Caitlin finally broke. She collapsed onto the grass, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. It was not the theatrical, rehearsed crying she had displayed at the dinner party. It was the raw, ugly weeping of a woman who had just watched the foundation of her entire aristocratic life disintegrate into dust. The country club memberships, the leased Porsche, the sprawling mansion in Silicon Valley, it was all gone. I looked down at them from the porch. They were a pathetic sight, a king and queen of ashes, kneeling in the ruins of an empire they tried to steal because they lacked the competence to build their own. I did not feel sorry for them. I felt the cold, clean satisfaction of absolute justice. "Garrett," I said, my voice carrying no malice, only the chilling finality of an execution. "You have exactly 5 minutes to get off my property before I have Hank and his crew physically remove you. And I strongly suggest you spend the drive home securing a very good criminal defense attorney, because when the SEC reviews the dossier I forwarded to their regional director this morning, bankruptcy will be the least of your concerns." Garrett did not argue. He did not threaten me. He was completely broken. He reached down, grabbed Caitlin by the arm, and hauled her to her feet. They stumbled across the great lawn, walking a gauntlet of silent, glaring faces. The investors watched them with disgust. The vineyard workers watched them with triumph. They climbed into their leased Range Rover. The engine roared to life, kicking up a cloud of white dust as Garrett slammed the accelerator, fleeing the estate in a desperate, humiliating retreat. I watched the dust settle on the gravel driveway. The silence returned to the lawn, but it was no longer heavy. It was light. It was the collective exhale of an ecosystem that had just survived a deadly infection. I turned away from the driveway and looked out at the crowd. I met Hank's eyes. He nodded slowly, a deep, respectful acknowledgement. I looked at Arthur Vance, who raised his glass of Pinot Noir in a silent toast. I had protected the vines. I had protected the families. The harvest celebration resumed. It was quieter than usual, more reflective, but the atmosphere was thick with a profound sense of gratitude. The threat had been neutralized. The legacy was secure. I stepped down from the porch and walked out toward the south block of the vineyard. The heritage clones Julian had planted were thriving. The leaves were a deep, vibrant green, the grapes heavy and dark, promising an exceptional vintage. I reached out and touched one of the leaves. It was rough, resilient, built to survive the harsh California sun. I stood alone in the vines, the faint sounds of the celebration drifting over the hills. And for the first time since Julian died, I felt a genuine, profound peace. I had not just survived the storm, I had become it. The true aftermath, however, did not unfold on the vineyard. It unfolded exactly where I had orchestrated it, in the sterile, unforgiving corridors of federal jurisdiction. At 9 o'clock the following morning, Garrett Sterling walked into the sleek, glass-fronted lobby of his commercial real estate firm in downtown San Jose. He was operating on zero sleep, frantic with the impending collapse of his financial house of cards. He was carrying a briefcase filled with documents he desperately needed to shred. He never made it to the shredder. As the elevator doors opened to his executive floor, he was greeted by 12 federal agents wearing blue windbreakers with the letters FBI emblazoned across the back. They were accompanied by 2 senior investigators from the Securities and Exchange Commission colleagues I had worked with closely for nearly a decade. They did not ask for a meeting. They presented a federal search warrant, secured entirely on the 54-page forensic dossier I had anonymously forwarded to the regional director 72 hours earlier. The raid was devastatingly thorough. They seized hard drives, physical ledgers, and encrypted communication servers. They locked down the corporate banking portals. They froze Garrett's personal and business assets simultaneously. By noon, the financial news networks were breaking the story. Prominent Silicon Valley real estate developer raided in multi-million-dollar fraud investigation. The headlines detailed allegations of forged appraisals, illegal diversion of bridge loan capital, and a sophisticated Ponzi structure used to keep the firm afloat. Garrett was not arrested immediately. That is not how white-collar federal investigations work. They let the target twist in the wind, while they meticulously dismantle their life piece by piece. But his firm was dead, his reputation was incinerated, his investors, led by Arthur Vance's warnings, had completely abandoned him. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Caitlin's name. I did not answer. I sat at Julian's heavy oak desk in the study, watching the phone buzz on the polished wood. She left a voicemail. I listened to it exactly once. Stella, please. Her voice was hysterical, barely coherent between jagged sobs. The FBI is here. They are seizing the cars. They froze our checking accounts. We don't have anything. We can't even pay the mortgage. Garrett is locked in the study. He won't talk to me, please. Stella, you have to call them off. We are family. I'm begging you. I deleted the voicemail. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I had not forced Garrett to forge appraisals. I had not forced Caitlin to weaponize my grief and attempt to lock me in a conservatorship. They had built their own pyre. I simply handed them the match. The following months were a masterclass in rebuilding. I officially resigned from my position at the intelligence firm. I had spent a decade dismantling other people's empires, and it was time to focus entirely on cultivating my own. I assumed full operational control of Sterling Estate. I did not sell the lakefront property. Instead, I expanded the tasting room, hired 3 new viticulturists, and increased the salaries of all 47 families who worked the land. The vintage we harvested that year, the heritage clones Julian had planted on our wedding day, was extraordinary. We bottled it under a special reserve label. I named it The Architect, in honor of the man who built the foundation, and the woman who ensured it would never fall. Garrett eventually accepted a plea deal, facing 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy. He agreed to serve 8 years in a minimum security facility in Nevada. Caitlin filed for divorce 3 days before his sentencing. She moved into a small apartment in Sacramento, forced to take a job as a receptionist at a mid-tier dental clinic. The aristocratic illusion she had clung to so desperately was entirely erased. I never spoke to either of them again. The process of securing the vineyard was not merely legal, it was deeply physical. In the weeks that followed Garrett's arrest, I spent my mornings walking the rows of the heritage clones. The California sun baked the soil, releasing the complex, earthy aromas that Julian had dedicated his life to cultivating. I learned the precise way the canopy needed to be pruned to maximize sun exposure. I learned how to test the sugar content of the grapes by tasting them right off the vine, feeling the tart, vibrant juice burst against my tongue. The harvest that autumn was the most bountiful Sterling estate had ever seen. The weather was perfect, hot days and cool, foggy nights that allowed the grapes to mature slowly, developing an incredible depth of flavor. I stood in the crushing room, surrounded by the deafening roar of the distemmers, breathing in the intoxicating, yeasty scent of fermentation. Hank stood beside me, wiping sweat from his forehead, holding a glass of the fresh must. He took a sip, closed his eyes, and smiled. Julian was right about this block, Stella, Hank said, his voice barely audible over the machinery. This is going to be a vintage people talk about for decades. We are going to make sure they do, Hank, I replied. I oversaw the bottling of the architect myself. I watched the dark ruby-red liquid fill the heavy glass bottles. I designed the label, a minimalist, elegant silver crest against a matte black background. It was sophisticated, powerful, and undeniable, exactly what Sterling Estate had become. When the first case of the architect was ready, I did not sell it. I took a single bottle, walked down to the lakefront cabin, and sat on the wraparound porch. I poured 2 glasses. I placed one on the small wooden table next to me, leaving it untouched. I raised my own glass to the sunset, watching the light refract through the deep red wine. We did it, Julian, I whispered to the empty air, feeling the cool evening breeze off the water. The roots held. I drank the wine in silence. It tasted like survival. It tasted like victory. And it tasted profoundly like peace. There is a profound, undeniable power in silence. We are taught, especially as women, that when we are attacked, we must immediately defend ourselves. We must shout our truth, argue our competence, and demand to be heard. But noise is exactly what predators expect. Noise tells them you are panicked. Noise gives them a target. Silence, however, is terrifying. Silence is the discipline of a sniper, waiting for the target to step into the crosshairs. When they underestimate you, when they assume you are weak because you are quiet, do not correct them. Let them believe their own narrative. Let them walk confidently onto the battlefield, entirely unaware that you have already mined it. Gather your data, secure your leverage, document every lie, every misstep, every moment of arrogant overreach. And when the time is right, when the stakes are highest and the audience is watching, do not scream. Do not argue. Simply lay your cards on the table, speak the truth with absolute, icy precision, and watch their entire empire collapse under the weight of their own greed. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever been the quiet one in the room, while the loudest voices tried to tear you down, I want you to remember this: silence is not surrender. It is strategy. Leave a comment below if you have ever executed a flawless counter move against someone who underestimated you. Share this video with the strong women in your life who need a reminder that true power does not need to shout. Hit that subscribe button to join the Alpha Empower community. Keep building your empires, keep trusting your instincts, and never, ever apologize for the strength you forged in the dark. Thank you for listening. Stay sharp, stay quiet, and let them wonder how you won.